Hi, I'm Kim Walker with the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and on today's blog, I'm going to answer 5 common questions about coordinated assessment. We got these questions just by looking through our previous webinars on the topic, and then also things that we get asked a lot by communities. I think the biggest thing any system can do here first is make sure that their domestic violence providers and their homeless assistance providers are working together. They both have expertise in overlapping areas, but also in different areas. And I think making those connections between the providers ensures that survivors can also access resources on both sides, the homeless assistance and domestic violence sides, a lot easier. So, one thing you want to do right away is make sure that you are working together, that you're attending each other's meetings, that there's at least one domestic violence representative on your COC board or governing body, for example. Some other things to think about are training for homeless assistance provider staff on domestic violence issues, things that may come up for survivors. There are survivors that are in the system already that may or may not have identified themselves. So it's important that everyone that's working with someone who's experiencing homelessness is able to deal with the domestic violence side of that as well. When it comes to coordinated assessment specifically, I think it's really important that survivors have a safe place to go or a safe way to be assessed. And that may not always be a place where they have to go to in person because that may increase the risk of, for example, an abuser being able to stalk them or locate them more easily if they know that they're trying to access those services. So it can be really great to have a telephone or a phone component as well to a coordinated assessment process just to make that connection for the survivor easier to make with the system. I think it's also a good idea to kind of combine your assessment processes for survivors and for other homeless assistance, other people seeking homeless assistance. And the reason for that is that you want to make sure that survivors can access resources like domestic violence shelters, but you also want to make sure that they're able to make connections to other housing resources, especially rapid rehousing programs and other more permanent housing programs, that they're not getting cut off from those resources if they're just entering one specific shelter, for example. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. I think ideally having one coordinated assessment process for everyone that's able to meet the needs of both populations in terms of data and safety and confidentiality is ideal. But I think each community is going to have that conversation for themselves and figure out how to make that work. The most important thing is protecting survivors' safety as well as being able to connect them with housing. And again, there may be different ways of doing that, but ultimately, when it comes to assessment, just like with any other population, the goal for survivors should be to connect them to the most appropriate housing resource. And that resource may exist in the domestic violence system or not, but we want to make sure that they can get there. I think one thing to say right off the bat is that you shouldn't plan on there being just one assessment tool. I think a lot of communities have thought about this as kind of different assessment tools that are all part of one assessment process. So, for example, you may want to have a set of questions to ask people right away to see if their needs can be met with prevention or diversion resources, and that will typically be very short. And we have an example of a tool like that in our coordinated assessment toolkit on the website. You may have a separate tool for people that have had to enter shelter that weren't able to access those prevention resources or were kind of past that point. And then you're doing a deeper assessment to figure out what the next step is for them to help them meet their permanent housing needs. And that's where you're going to address barriers to obtaining housing. So, looking at things like income, criminal history, rental history, those kinds of things to help create a plan and select an intervention that will help them overcome those barriers and get into permanent housing. So, those will likely be 2 separate documents. They may be done by the same organization, they may not be. So I think the best way to start is to think about all the questions you would want to ask someone to help them find housing. And the key there is also you want to ask questions to help them find housing. You want to save the questions about more personal things, other goals they might have, for example, for their case manager. So it may be appropriate not to ask those in the assessment tools necessarily, but once they've gotten to a program, to have their case manager kind of address some of those other not housing related issues with the household. Another great way to get started with assessment tools is to look at what other communities have done. And again, I know on our website we have a bunch of different samples from different communities at various stages in the process, some prevention diversion, some housing barrier assessment. So it's always good to not have to start from scratch. So I would look at what you have already. I would look at what other communities have done and keep in mind those questions about what do I need to know at this stage to figure out what the next step is for prevention and diversion. What do I need to know to figure out if this person is eligible for these things once they're in shelter or somewhere else awaiting placement into a more permanent housing program or unit? What questions do I need to ask then? And kind of, I suggest working through it that way. It's probably the easiest way to do it. I want to say that a lot of people understand that it is of benefit, but maybe this is something for people who are trying to kind of get other people to buy into the model, that it's good to have some talking points here. In terms of as a system overall, I think it creates a much more effective system. One thing that you're forced to do when you adopt a coordinated assessment process is learn what you already have in the system and what you already have in the community, as well as what you don't have. Because in order to send people to the place that's of best fit or the program of best fit for them, you have to know what each program offers. And oftentimes, just going through that process, you can see things like duplicative services or other problems or very big gaps. So, just the knowledge that you gain from starting on the path toward coordinated assessment can be really helpful for creating a system that's more fit to serve the community and the consumer need. I also think it makes it easier for the system as a whole in terms of data collection. If you have a centralized process for doing that, it doesn't even have to be through one place, but just one single process for collecting certain information. It makes it a lot easier to ensure that you're getting accurate information and that it's the same information from everybody. It kind of cuts down on different people doing different things. In terms of the provider benefits, it really comes down to maximizing what your program is meant to do. So I think with coordinated assessment, what you're going to see is that people will be assessed not by the programs anymore individually, but by whatever process the community chooses, and then programs will be receiving people that are, someone has said this person is a good fit for your program already. So that reduces the time the program is spending reassessing people to see if they're a good fit or assessing people to see if they're a good fit, and also I think gives them a better chance of achieving really good outcomes because they're going to be serving more people that are a right fit for the type of program and services and housing that they offer. And again, it's also an opportunity to take some of the burden off of your staff to kind of take in a bunch of phone calls or assess a bunch of consumers that ultimately may not be the right fit for your program. And I think perhaps the group that we want to think about the most in this is the consumers. A lot of consumers right now, they're Googling in their communities to figure out where they should go if they're having housing trouble of some sort. They're calling around every single day. They're on a million different wait lists. And the coordinated assessment process, if advertised properly, can really make it a lot easier for them to access the help they need without going around to multiple different agencies, without being asked the same questions over and over again, and potentially re-traumatizing them really. So, and this is something that we've heard from communities that have talked about doing these consumer focus groups, that consumers across the board are saying this has made things easier for me. And I think ultimately that's what all of us want, and that might be the biggest selling point of the model. So I think there are probably a few different levels of involvement. I think you definitely want a core committee that's going to be tasked with making things happen. That usually works if that's a smaller group of people. How you define small will probably depend on the size of your community and your provider community as a whole. But I would say you definitely want to include some major funders, ESG and continuum of care stakeholders, a couple of the larger providers, particularly organizations where you think they might end up being your coordinated assessment lead agency, the place where assessments are being done or who are staffing the assessment process. And then if they're not kind of in these groups already, some people from local government. And I think every community has additional stakeholders that it just makes sense to bring them to the table, and those people may vary by community. But I think you start with a group like that, a smaller group, And then from there, you have that group kind of take on the task of laying out a timeline of work that needs to get done, deciding what the major steps are, figuring out if they need help to accomplish those steps, and then bringing in other people as necessary. And then one of the most important things that group can do is kind of create a process for how they're going to involve the larger community. Because you certainly don't want that group to kind of get the ball rolling and then make all of the decisions and come to the rest of the community and say, this is what our process is. You want to make sure that you're communicating with providers, educating providers about what this will mean for them. And I think one of the core tasks of this small, we'll call it steering committee, is to figure out how to do that. Are you going to have meetings with providers monthly about what's going on? Are you going to gather feedback from them in a certain form, surveys through these meetings, for example? How are you going to get feedback, as well as how are you going to give information about what's happening? That's something that you want to start thinking about right away. You obviously want to include consumers. I think it's great to have someone experiencing homelessness or who has experienced it on that steering committee as well. That's one person I didn't mention. But you also want to make sure you're getting it from a larger group of consumers. So that could also be focus groups, surveys, etc. And a lot of this, again, we have in our coordinated assessment toolkit. We have consumer surveys to use with that population to figure out what their needs are. We also have our coordinated assessment checklist, which kind of goes through some of the things to think about as you're going through the planning process. So I would refer you to both of those documents. I think this is one of the biggest points that sometimes gets lost in just going through the logistics of coordinated assessment. Coordinated assessment is a great model. It can create a more effective and efficient system. It can end homelessness more quickly for people or prevent them from having to enter the system at all of which are huge things. But ultimately, if you're not looking at coordinated assessment as it relates to the rest of the system, you're missing the big picture. For coordinated assessment to work effectively, for the system to change, and I've said this before, and I'm sure I'll say it again, your programs will also have to change. If you have a lot of programs now that have very restrictive requirements, and often this is done, without realizing the effect of it, if you have programs, for example, that won't admit people that are currently using drugs, if that requirement stays in place while coordinated assessment is happening, then people are still going to be screened out of those programs. So it's really important to have conversations with providers about the whole spirit of coordinated assessment is being able to find a place for everyone, that it's not us trying to fit people into our system as much as it is trying to adapt our system to the need. And if you have a need among people that are currently using, you have to find a way to adjust to that need. Oftentimes, that's going to require revising program requirements or dropping them altogether, especially the ones that aren't related to some kind of funding source, because I know a lot of funders may mandate certain things. And that's a hard conversation to have. That being said, a lot of communities have done that, have started to have those conversations, and I've also had providers say, I'm willing to put these requirements aside to make sure that I'm able to serve the people that need help. So that's a really big part of this process, is talking about those entrance requirements. And, it may not be that they all disappear, but it may be at least that you have a conversation about what happens if things stay as they are now. Does our system really improve with coordinated assessment if we're not changing these other things? I think that's the key conversation to have. Another important thing to think about is your back door. Again, if you have people coming into the system, going to the right programs right away, or the program that's a best fit for them sooner rather than having to call around and jump between programs first, that's great. And that will reduce length of stay to an extent. But if those people are still being trapped in programs, if they're not finding a way to permanent housing quickly, then it's not really going to have the intended effect of the whole model. So you have to be looking at your back door, and that means looking at expanding rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing in your communities. And it also means each program needs to figure out its role in helping people move to permanent housing. That's shelter, transitional housing. Every type of program needs to be thinking about their role in moving people into permanent housing quickly and incorporating that housing focus within how their staff function, having case managers that are making housing focused case plans, having upper level staff that are champions for housing first and for moving people to permanent housing, having outcomes and measuring outcomes that are geared toward those health outcomes of moving people into permanent housing quickly and stabilizing them there. all of those pieces have to come together for coordinated assessment to really work in the intended way. So this is a great improvement to a system, but it is just one piece. So it's important not to lose sight of those other pieces that have to come together for everything to work. And I think that will be it today for our 5 questions, but we hope you enjoyed this. And if you have any other questions you'd like to submit for future blogs, be sure to send those to thecenter@naeh.org. Thanks a lot.